So for our final conversation, I'm really excited about this really important fireside chat and discussion that I believe needs to happen. It's going to be around policy, regulations, and perspectives for moving clinical AI forward. And I know that this is really important because every other day I get another question about, when I want to route this AI to, what are the FDA liabilities, regulations, and such questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce our esteemed panelists. First off, Mello, who's a JD PhD, Professor of Law, Health Policy at Stanford University. And we are very, very happy to have Dr. Julia back on stage because unfortunately, Dr. Kavita Patel couldn't join us today. And finally, we have my mentor, Dr. Kevin Schulman. He's the Interim Co-Chief, Division of Hospital Medicine, Stanford Professor. And all of them are giants in the healthcare policy as well as regulatory space. So please.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having us. And sorry, the regulatory has to be the last of the day. We should be first. So, I was interesting to look at the title and in the world that we're living in. Our question today is a policy perspective on moving clinical AI forward. And, it's a different question maybe than when the panel was envisioned 6 months ago, given where the world is. So. But I want to really think about that concept. How do we move this technology forward? Stanford's all about this idea of needs-based, innovation. And we have massive problems in healthcare, and potentially they're going to get worse by whatever happens with federal legislation. So cost, quality, and access issues, we have a potential solution to those problems in terms of AI. How do we responsibly move that forward, but move that forward at the speed at which the policy environment's changing, the economic landscape's changing, the political environment's changing. So maybe we start with that as a first question. Not how do we, I should say I'm reading Ezra Klein's Abundance right now, and his argument is the left has been really focused on process and not outcomes. And if we want to improve the quality of our environment, we have to build high-speed rail, not make sure that the high-speed rail line meets all environmental quality standards, and not have the technology in the first place. So as the worst-case scenario, we could have amazing regulations and no technology. How do we balance those two in terms of safety and effectiveness, and really bringing what looks to be amazing technology forward to patients? So, Michelle, that's a lot to ask for.
Yeah, well, it's sort of the million-dollar question. And I think, as you say, 6 months ago, people would have answered that question in a different way. I think today, the worry is no longer that regulation is going to be put in place in a hurried way in response to this pressure to do something, and Congress is going to get it all wrong, and then it's going to hamper innovation. I think the worry now is because the new administration has announced a position that essentially says that any regulation is a barrier to innovation. There will be none, and so we'll have an unregulated marketplace. I will say as a lawyer, I take umbrage at the notion that any regulation will stifle innovation because we know that lots of forms of regulation provide a substructure through which markets can work well. So the classic example would be antitrust regulation. We know there are emerging anti-competitive practices in the AI space already around data hoarding, data sharing. Consumer protection law is another example of law that makes markets better. So I think that's just wrong. The question is then, what kind of regulation and how do we get it? And I think right now, in the absence of any federal interest, I really see a market failure. I see a market that provides incentives for adopters to experiment with AI, but doesn't provide enough natural incentives for healthcare organizations and others to put in place robust governance schemes because they're not required to. That's costly and hard. And absent any mechanism for getting reimbursed for that kind of work, why would you? Why would you? So we can get into discussion of liability maybe as sort of a backstop to create those kind of incentives. But right now, I think we have a market failure, and lawyers would again say when you've got a market failure, that is when you need the government to step in and create a playing field that is level and fair.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with that. And I think we actually have data that shows that underinvestment. And so I've actually been on the road showing that data to policymakers that like we see that only about half of hospitals are testing models locally for bias. And so, I mean, I think that case is, I hope we'll get the message out. I might just add maybe a couple of points to that. I mean, I have to say that we've had a huge amount of bipartisan engagement even since the new administration around AI regulation. And so I know we have this like gestalt sense of like anti-regulation, but we've continued to see, I think, a lot of interest around particularly from, I'd say, you know, a subset of congressional staffers that really seem like they want to invest in this space and understanding what good regulation would look like. So I'm like a little optimistic, at least, that there's a pathway for some thoughtful regulation here. But I will say that I think we're also coming off an era of like bad health IT policy. And I think we are still thinking about some of the reverberations from like the whole meaningful use framework and like just this sense that the government doesn't really know how to tell healthcare organizations how to use technology well. And so, and I think that that's a legitimate criticism. And so, you know, part of it is also about like, how do we identify how to use policy, which is a blunt instrument, in this context in a way that is effective without getting into the weeds and a regulation that I think ultimately didn't do its job. So those might be my sort of two contextual pieces that I actually think there is opportunity for regulation, but I think we still don't see clearly what that vehicle should be that will feel like it does what we hope it will do.
Yeah, in the absence of the federal space, you know, a lot of what we've heard about today are things that are moving forward, potentially even moving forward to the clinic here at Stanford. So as a provider organization, if there, you know, even though there's no federal regulation, there's liability, there's other concerns, you know, what is it that we should do about how we think about rolling out, you know, large language models to patients, algorithms, some of which are clinical, like, you know, how do I, you know, who's at risk for sepsis? But some of them are going to be administrative, like who's at risk for going home with oxygen, so I can order the oxygen a day before, you know, they're discharged, and so I could shorten length of stay. So lots of different ways that this technology could be used. You know, what should we do in terms of, as an organization, and can we put the onus on provider organizations to be the responsible stewards of this technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a lot today that, many health systems have invested in robust AI governance, and like I'm like 0% worried about the Stanfords and UCSFs of the world, frankly. Like I think we've had the luxury of investing in governance, and we have the experts to put around the table to staff those committees. And I think, again, the breadth of people you need to do AI governance well, like you're just not going to find those people in settings outside of academic medical centers. So I am much more concerned about sort of every other health system that's out there that just won't have the expertise, let alone the resources, to do what I see being done here. And I think, most other academic medical centers, I think, again, having just come from like a set of meetings where this has been the main topic is sort of how to build AI governance. I think a lot of health systems have like a person whose job it is now to think about this. And so that's like a step forward. But I think we really have to figure out how we scale that work. And I think everyone does feel like they're reinventing the wheel, which is a very inefficient way to do AI governance. So again, looking to some of the communities of practice that are trying to build up some of these capabilities to figure out how we can do that governance in a scalable way so that it can touch all healthcare delivery settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one thing we should be doing is leading by example. If we have the resources, we have the expertise, and we have leadership that is committed to strong governance, we should be showing others that it can be done effectively, and it can be done efficiently. And we should be sharing out our learning. So, to the comment you made this morning, this should not be like phone a friend governance. We should be putting tools out there to enable lower resource institutions not to have to start from zero every time. And that is something that we're doing here. And I think we're justifiably proud of our contribution in that area. I have other things on our wish list for Stanford. As a lawyer, I can't be 0% worried, or I would be disbarred. But I think that one thing we can continue to work on, again, to your comments this morning, is resourcing monitoring. I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. That is a huge issue, that the more we accrete models, the more we accrete obligations to do monitoring, and that money needs to come from somewhere. I think another thing we can do is be choosy. I think that our role model for AI adoption should not be the magpie, it should be the cat. Magpies go around collecting shiny things to line their nests with. A cat, if it's not happy with what's in the food bowl, will give you a long look and just walk away. And we should be willing to walk away if a tool is not demonstrably well-performing, not likely to work here, doesn't pass the ethical review, and isn't proved to be best in class. And so I think that one thing that we can really usefully do with AI governance is help the organization sometimes say no. And then lastly, I'll add, I think that something we can be doing more of is advocating for ourselves with vendors. So I have noticed as a lawyer, a lot of times the terms of service that we're presented with by vendors absolves them of any accountability for the quality of their product. Some of the vendors who've spoken here today, you can go online and look at their terms of service and you will find that they accept zero liability, not just for misuse of their product, but for ordinary warranties saying my product works the way it's supposed to work. No other product maker in the country is allowed to do that. And if we don't push back on that and advocate for ourselves, they will continue to do that, and that messes up the whole ecosystem of accountability. It puts all the onus on hospitals and, at the end of the day, on doctors and nurses for things that go wrong, and it doesn't create the right incentives for them to invest in safety.
Can I just double down on that for 1 second? Because I
Sure.
totally agree that, and again, I think there's a lot of bipartisan interest in like transparency as a concept in the industry, because it is, I think it benefits, it has many layers of benefit. I will say that, I think there's also this tricky trade-off between the companies that are willing to be more liable and transparent and work with us, like also tend to be the less technologically sophisticated ones. And so you're almost caught in this like tension between, do we want to work with like the big guys who have the better, oftentimes, or at least more market tested product versus the ones who are a little scrappier, but you don't know if they're going to be in business in 3 to 5 years. And so I think we're really feeling some of those vendor dynamics in an acute way where there's this trade-off in terms of some of the issues that you described.
One of the projects earlier today was a tool that we built to summarize the chart for discharge planning as a first step to see. I should say I'm co-chief of hospital medicine, and so our challenge is how do we improve physician productivity. And for hospital medicine, it's not listening to the patient, not just listening to the patient, but it's going through the enormous record that the patient, that we have. What happened? What do we do? How do we communicate to other people? And as we're about to roll that out as a pilot. And what we realized really quickly is if we tested on 100 people, which would be a massive clinical test that we just talked about, we'd know, from a drug development standpoint or technology development, we look at safety and efficacy and safety. Efficacy will be proven, safety will be unknown, really unknown. And so how do we bring out, like as we're responsible stewards of these things, how do we build in a process to collect adverse event information and figure out, what, this algorithm really goes haywire when we take that heart transplant patient who's on, an ACE inhibitor, the thing goes crazy, Yeah,
I mean, this is a lot of what we're thinking about within our monitoring framework. And I think what's tricky is that there's rare event monitoring, which has a whole approach to it all the way to monitoring of very different, concepts, things that need human. The only way to do it is through human review. And so I don't know that I have the answer other than, I think we have to keep patient safety as the North Star and at a minimum be thinking about where and how to identify those. But I am nervous about our capabilities to do that. It's not like we have a robust history of capturing and addressing adverse events in other contexts. And so I don't think we're building on a really robust infrastructure to do that well to begin with. But I think in our AI governance conversations, we are talking a lot about that and how to do that particular piece of the monitoring well.
I think I would add that even if we were able to do that well, we're only, of course, looking at the very tip of the iceberg of potential flaws when we're looking at harm that reaches patients. You know, in patient safety parlance, what we should be more interested in are all the near misses that didn't reach patients because some tired nurse took the time at the end of her day to fix the note, or some physician took the time to click through to a source document and make sure that this generated summary was correct. And that's a lot to put on them. I know they feel very much like they have to do it. And so it's entirely possible that these things might be making errors a lot, but they never reach patients only because clinicians intervene. And that's something we also really want to know if at the end of the day what we care about is this a product that is helping our staff, helping our patients?
Yeah, so, one of the things that we're really challenged by is we think there's flaws in the clinical process. We think we make errors according to the National Academy of Medicine. We think there's errors in transcription, there's errors in the chart. And so we have the current standard, whatever level of error we have. And then we have this new technology that offers us the potential not to be perfect, but better than the standard of care. How do we deal with that? Do we need to prove, is it a randomized clinical trial, we're better than nothing, which is the standard for drug development, or do we need to prove some level of absolute safety?
Well, I can't imagine how you would ever have absolute safety in any healthcare process. I mean, surely the appropriate comparator has to be the counterfactual, whatever that might be. What would this patient have gotten in routine care? That's how the courts would think about it if a patient was suing because they got hurt through this care process. And that lodestar, I think, has served us pretty well. The problem is, from an ex-ante perspective, that people don't think about risk in the same way when it's human-generated, familiar, everyday, common, versus machine-generated, unusual, and novel. And so we've got kind of an optics problem around adoption of AI because of that asymmetric risk perception.
I mean, maybe it's just putting a finer point on what you said, but I think like the malpractice world thinks about this differently than the regulatory world. And I think the regulatory world is much more likely to swiftly move in if there's a high-profile failure and say, like, okay, we've got to slow or shut this down. I mean, I think that the malpractice system takes a very different perspective against what is the standard of care and if you can show that you are meeting that. So that, to my mind, is like sort of what I'm watching for is like which, when something bad happens, which it will, like what, sort of how do these two systems respond and react, and how does that then set the tone for what this looks like moving forward?
Yeah, coming back to this idea about moving the technology forward, we have 50 different states with 50 different state governments. If the federal government doesn't take coordinated action, then states are left to do what they want. Is for industry, is that more of a risk in a landscape where there is no, obviously industry is arguing against regulations, but then they could get hit with 50 different state things that would go in different directions. So kind of looking out, did industry get what they want, or are they in worse case than they would have been?
Well, they got what they wanted, and the House Appropriations Bill has a provision in it saying that there shall be no state regulation of AI for 10 years, which is the kind of thing that Congress sometimes inserts into bills when it intends to itself occupy a regulatory field. We call that preemption. But here Congress has done nothing and is also saying states can do nothing. Now, whether that will pass the Senate and whether it's just flat out illegal are two very good questions. But we're now looking at a future where I think this danger of the patchwork it might be overblown. I mean, of course it's real. From an innovation perspective, you don't want 50 different legal regimes. That's terrible. It's also terrible if you care about equity because patients in Alabama will not have the same degree of protection that they have in California. But there are things that one learns about state policymaking. One is that because they have low content area expertise and resources, they actually copy each other quite a lot. So they share ideas, they collaborate, and so you get a lot of replication of state laws across states, particularly in novel areas. Right now, that's a bad thing, not a good thing, because most of their ideas are not so good. And so fortunately, they're also really incremental and not likely to have much of an effect.
I'm not sure I have much to add. I mean, I think, again, they're experimentation, because I think we are still trying to find the right policy framework, has some benefits, but there's also some real risks to experimentation and having each state do this on its own. And so it's really hard to predict, I think, what like the optimal looks like. And yeah, and I mean, I think you described the federal mess very well.
We have to end on an optimistic note. You know, we have all of these, we definitely have all these challenges. This technology is really amazing. Look, it's only, you know, relatively recent. And the fact that we don't know how to use it, you know, the genome was 25 years ago, and we're still struggling with how to use the Human Genome Project. You know, what are the things that you see that are kind of closest that might end up being models for governance when we wake up from this and decide that we want to move forward?
I think there are plenty of academic medical centers that have really adopted very, I guess I say, again, robust and scalable solutions for governance. And I think those are really bright stars in the landscape. You know, I also am heartened by the efforts of clinicians to try to be good governors of these technologies. I think part of it is fear-driven. They understand that at the end of the day, it's their license on the line. But at the end of the day, of course, they want to make patient care better and make their own lives better only to the extent that it's commensurate with good quality care. So I worry less and less about automation bias the more I talk with physicians and nurses and really understand the depth of their commitment to protecting patients.
I mean, I actually am quite optimistic in general because I think there are so many important problems to solve. And for the first time, we are seeing technology solutions that really are meeting the moment and solving problems. And then that begets more interest in the solutions. And so when I see the number of stakeholders in our health system who are coming to the table saying, like, can AI help us solve this problem? You know, they aren't the technology enthusiasts. They're the owners of the problems. And a lot of times the owners of the budgets to solve those problems. And so I think we're seeing just alignment for the first time in a really strong way between the people who really want our health system to run better and the people who really deeply understand the technology. And I think if that conversation can continue to go on, again, it has the robust governance, but then it also has the ROI conversation at the table. Like when all of those conversations are happening together, I think is actually when technology drives value. And that's definitely what we're seeing happen.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to panelists. We appreciate it.